Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, well, thank you. There you go, more like it. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Woody Register. I'm the director of the Roberson Project on slavery, race, and reconciliation here at Sewanee. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to our panel this evening. I want to make us, pardon me if I don't want to embarrass y'all anything, but a special shout out for the students who came tonight from St. Andrew's Sewanee School. Thank you very much for doing that and joining us. Yeah. It's great to see y'all, and especially good to see this good crowd, and to welcome those of you who are joining us by Zoom this evening. The Roberson Project has invited to our campus next week the two authors of one of the most important and provocative new works on the justice and the need to pay reparations to the descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. We are bringing the authors to our campus next week. Of course, I'm talking about Dr. William A. Darity Jr. and Ms. A. Kirsten Mullen, and their book, published in 2020, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. This is an event that has been gestating in our minds, I think of Clark Strickland and my mind, for 2 years, I think. When we saw them speak in person and immediately wanted to bring them to campus. So we're excited that they will be joining us next week. But to lay the ground for a full and informed and vigorous engagement next week with Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullen, the Roberson Project has sponsored a number of events and programs this semester. First, we have a campus reparations book club that is superintended and designed by Dr. Andrew McGinn, who is our senior research associate, who has just joined us at the beginning of August and is already fully involved in campus life and in helping us develop programs. So we're very grateful to Dr. McGinn for designing and putting and overseeing this book club for the last month or so and through the rest of the semester. We've also organized 2 panels. 10 or 11 days ago, we were joined on Zoom by 2 people who have been in the Center of Programs and Movements for Reparation at 2 institutions of higher education. Ms. Ebony Davis from Virginia Theological Seminary joined us, and Mr. Miles Estevez Lewis, a senior at Georgetown University, was also with us by Zoom. And this was an event that was held at the School of Theology here. They generously shared what they have learned from their experience in leading, or at least in the case of Georgetown, trying to lead their respective institutions to undertake programs of reparative justice, of reparation. And especially meaningful in their presentations were their reflections about the impact, moral, spiritual, and emotional impact of reparation programs on students on their campus, and especially in the case of the Virginia Seminary, on the descendants of enslaved people who had been exploited by those institutions. Our second panel, of course, is tonight. And I want to quickly yield the floor to our colleagues and teachers and neighbors who have so generously agreed to share their perspectives on reparations with us. Each comes from a different disciplinary corner of our curriculum. And I've asked each of our panelists to deepen our understanding of the issues at stake by exploring how scholars in their respective disciplines, and they in particular, approach and think about and assess the arguments like those made by Professor Darity and Ms. Mullen, who are advocating the payment of reparations to the descendants of the enslaved. So allow me to introduce our panelists tonight. First, we have Professor Katherine Theyson, who's an associate professor and chair of the Department of Economics. And she also, for those of you who can remember, led the business program at Sewanee through its tumultuous but explosive years of growth. She's known by her students and colleagues for her excellence in the classroom, and her teaching and research focus on the fields of international trade and development and the monitoring and enforcement of environmental regulations. She earned her PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a BA in chemistry at North Carolina State University. Professor Matthew Mitchell is an associate professor in the Department of History, and he teaches courses on all eras of the history of Britain and Ireland, with a particular focus on the early modern period. That is around from 1500 to 1850, and British commercial and colonial contacts with the Atlantic world. Professor Mitchell is the author of the recently published The Prince of Slavers, an examination of the life and career of Humphrey Morris, the largest volume British slave trader of the first half of the 18th century, a man who bears the guilt of forcibly transporting over 30,000 enslaved Africans between 1704 and 1732. As an undergraduate at the University of Washington, Professor Mitchell, not yet then a professor, but he majored in history, but he also graduated with a degree in business administration, which prepared him well to pursue research into the business of the global slave trade. Dr. Mitchell came to Sewanee after finishing his PhD in history at the University of Pennsylvania. Our third panelist is Professor Mark Hopwood, who's an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy, and like Professor Mitchell, a valued member of the Roberson Project working group. Professor Hopwood has said that everyone is capable of doing philosophy. And from working with him, he's convinced me that even I might be capable of doing philosophy, but only so long as he was my instructor. At Sewanee, he has taught classes in moral and political philosophy, the philosophy of art, ancient philosophy, and 20th century continental philosophy. His publications address the questions about the nature of love, the problem of selfishness, the connection between philosophy and literature, and also what it means to see others as fully human. It's only natural that someone with such interests would be on tonight's panel. Professor Hopwood earned a BA and MA from the University of Oxford and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. So we will start tonight's panel by hearing from each of our scholars in the reverse order in which I introduced them, meaning we will start, of course, with philosophy and Professor Hopwood, followed by Professors Mitchell and Thaison. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, and then I will start the Q&A afterward with a question, and then open the floor to questions and comments from those here tonight and those online. Please join me in welcoming Professors Hopwood, Mitchell, and Thaison. Thank you.
Is it okay if I just get up at the lectern? Is that okay if I stand up there? A hard time sitting still. Point microphone at your mouth. Okay, you can hear me okay? Good. All right, good evening, everyone. So I want to start by saying thank you so much to Woody, to Andy, Clark, October, all of the people who've been involved in organizing this panel. I think it's a really important conversation. I'm really honored to be part of it. And thank you all for being here as well. It's really great to see you all. So I've talked for 10 minutes about the philosophy of reparations for slavery, which is a huge topic. So I'm going to go very fast and give you what I think are some of the really key conceptual distinctions and arguments that we need to have in front of us to think about this topic from a philosophical perspective. So the first thing I want to say is that the ideas that I'm going to be talking about here are not really my own. I am taking these ideas from other scholars. Bernard Boxall, who's a philosopher, who's written extensively on reparations. I'm also going to be making some reference to the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates and to Darity and Mullen, who we're really excited to have here soon at Sewanee. Okay, so one thing that philosophers love to do is to define terms and make distinctions. So I want to start by doing that. So when we're talking about reparations, what are we talking about, like in general? Well, one way of thinking about reparations is as making amends for a wrong. It's a kind of general definition of reparations. And it's important, I think, to distinguish reparations from two closely connected concepts. So restitution and compensation. So one way to think about restitution is just returning something that's been lost or stolen. Compensation would be making sure that someone is not worse off for having lost something or stolen something. And these are close to reparation, but they're not exactly the same. Philosophers would say whether they're neither necessary nor sufficient for it. I think it's easier to understand what I mean by that by thinking about an example. So let's say that person A steals person B's bike. And then let's say they ride it around for 2 weeks and then bring it back with no explanation or apology. So in that case, you could say, well, there's been restitution. You got the bike back, but you wouldn't necessarily say there's been reparation. We haven't necessarily made amends for the wrong. So you can have restitution without reparation. I think it's also possible to say that you could have reparation in certain cases without restitution. So if one person kills a member of another person's family by drink driving, well, restitution is impossible there. The problem is you can't bring the person back. It doesn't necessarily mean that reparation is impossible. So let's say that the person in question accepts the judgment of the justice system. They make a sincere apology. They maybe dedicate the rest of their lives to educating people about drinking and driving. That might look like a form of reparation that doesn't involve restitution, because that's impossible. I think it's also important to say, however, that in some cases, reparation really does require restitution or compensation. So take the bike case again. If A steals B's bike and then comes back 2 weeks later and gives them a profuse apology, but there is no sign of the bike and they make no attempt at restitution or compensation, it seems reasonable to say reparation's not really been made. The apology doesn't really look sincere. So I think that's how some of those concepts interact with each other. So that's reparation in general. So one thing I think we can say, an upshot about this, is that reparation may involve, indeed in some cases it might require, restitution or compensation. But on the most fundamental level, reparation is about doing what's necessary to make amends for a wrong and to repair broken relationships. I think reparation has to do with relationships. Okay, so here's a problem. When we're thinking about reparations for slavery, how can it possibly make sense to talk about reparations for slavery when the people who were enslaved and the people who enslaved them are long dead? Surely it makes sense to talk about reparations made by a slaveholder to someone that they had enslaved when they're both still alive, but how can that make sense now? How can this be relevant for us now? So what I want to do is talk about three kinds of arguments that philosophers have given for making reparations for slavery in the present day. And these arguments often get run together. Like you see 2 or even 3 of them in the same article or text, but I think it's important to keep them separate because they have different kinds of consequences. Different things follow from them depending on which one you take. So they're the harm argument, the inheritance argument, and the spiritual renewal argument, or what I call the spiritual renewal argument. So the harm argument. So this is Bernard Boxall. So Boxall says, the harm argument relies on the idea that the transgressions of slavery initiated an unbroken chain of harms linked as cause and effect that began with the slaves and continues among African Americans to the present day. Therefore, since the transgressions of slavery harm present-day African Americans, they have rights to reparation against those who committed those transgressions. So the idea of the harm argument is to say, sure, like the institution of slavery may be in the past, or at least to some extent in the past, but the harms connected with slavery are not in the past. They're present. We see the effects of those harms in the present. And if we see the harms in the present, then people suffering from those harms have a right to demand reparation. So the harm argument makes that connection between the past and the present. That's the idea. Now, Ta-Nehisi Coates has a nice image of this, the credit card. He also uses the image of the knife. Like once you draw the knife out, it doesn't mean that you've mended the wrong. So this is the harm argument. So students of mine will know, I think there are problems with every argument. So when I say problems with the harm argument, this is not necessarily a bad argument, but there are some problems we need to think about when we're making it. So one problem is tracing cause and effect. It might look really complicated to figure out, well, how many of the harms that are currently being suffered in the present can be traced directly back to slavery? How many of those harms are due to Jim Crow? How many of those harms are due to other things? So there's a problem with establishing cause and effect. One way you can do it, right, is you can say, well, let's look at the difference in average family wealth between, say, black families and white families. We can calculate it that way. But then you face the question, well, are we really talking about reparations still at this point? Or are we just talking about fixing injustices that we see in the present? Like maybe we just think that wealth disparities based on race are unjust and we should be fixing them. But it's not so clear we're now talking about making reparation for the past. So there's another argument. I'm going very quickly here. I'm just only pausing to take breath. There's another argument that I think kind of helps with this problem. So here's the inheritance argument. This is Boxall. So the inheritance argument relies on the idea that present-day African Americans have inherited the rights to reparation that were owed their enslaved ancestors and was never paid. This is a different way of thinking about reparations. So now what we're saying is that at the time of slavery, or say after emancipation, it made sense to say that slaveholders owed reparations to the people they'd enslaved. That certainly seems clear. But if they owed those reparations and those reparations weren't paid, then those reparations are still owed to their descendants, the descendants of the enslaved people. But then they're also owed to the descendants of those people and their descendants and their descendants. And so again, the inheritance argument establishes a connection between slavery and the present. We can say the reparations we pay in the present are a kind of inheritance of something that was owed long ago. So that's how we make the connection. Now, the inheritance argument has different kinds of problems or challenges from the harm argument. So one problem is, well, how do you establish who's supposed to get the inheritance? So a long time ago, it is famously difficult to trace ancestry, particularly when you're talking about people who are enslaved. And so we face a kind of practical problem there. But we also face the problem that potentially, no matter how we do it, we might end up in a situation where there are people who suffer from present day harms associated with the legacy of slavery, but can't trace their descent back to people who were themselves enslaved and therefore wouldn't qualify for reparations. And this looks like a bad result. Like this doesn't necessarily look like a justice. This is a problem for the inheritance argument to figure out. Okay, so that's the harm argument and the inheritance argument. I think there's one more argument that's worth considering because in a way it goes to the point about relationship that I was making earlier. So this is the spiritual renewal argument. You see it in Ta-Nehisi Coates, but I think you also see it in other writers. Coates is just quite clear about it. I'm not going to read this whole passage, but here's a little bit of Coates. So Coates says, what I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. Reparations would mean the end of scarfing hot dogs on the 4th of July while denying the facts of our heritage. Reparations would mean the end of yelling patriotism while waving a Confederate flag. Reparations would mean a revolution of the American consciousness, a reconciling of our self-image as the great democratizer with the facts of our history. So I think what's important about what Coates is saying here is that when he talks about a payoff, a handout, or hush money, the worry about thinking about reparations purely in terms of restitution or compensation is if we're just thinking about it in those terms, the risk is that the payments don't look like reparation because they've not come along with the kind of change in consciousness, the kind of spiritual renewal that would be necessary for us to understand these payments truly as reparation. So I think the spiritual renewal argument is an important argument to add to the harm argument and the inheritance argument. Now, it also has its problems. So the idea of spiritual renewal might be seen as kind of vague, open to different interpretations, and it's easily deployed as an excuse for inaction. Like it's too easy to say, we've got to go through a process of spiritual renewal before we start paying anyone any money. And Darity and Mullen make this exact point. So they don't call it spiritual renewal, they call it atonement. But the point they're making in the quotation I have up here is that something like atonement or spiritual renewal is very hard to quantify. It's very hard to say when you're doing that. It's very hard to know when you've done it. And so instead, they choose to focus solely on restitution. At the same time, they acknowledge later in their book that it's hard to see how we would get something like a program of reparations payments going if it did not go along with some kind of change in the American consciousness. We would need that kind of change to make that possible. So I think they acknowledge the necessity of something like this. Okay, so I don't take too much time. So a couple of closing thoughts. So first of all, I think reparation is fundamentally about relationship. So any program of reparations that relies solely on restitution or compensation without something like a process of spiritual renewal seems to me like it's going to be incomplete. On the other hand, spiritual renewal can't just mean good thoughts and fine speeches. It's hard to imagine a serious process of spiritual renewal for American slavery that does not involve some kind of form of restitution or compensation. That's like the stolen bike case. But at the same time, the one other thing I'd offer is I think since reparations is about relationship, the process by which restitution or compensation is conducted seems to me like a central feature of the whole process. So we need to be asking questions like, who's in control of the money? Who makes the decisions? Whose voices are heard? Because if we're talking about a process that is trying to make amends for wrongs and repair broken relationships, we are not going to do that if the process by which we do it doesn't establish a different kind of relationship. And so that seems key to me. Okay, there are some references. I can share these slides, but I will yield the floor to my colleagues. But thank you all. I'm looking forward to the questions.
All right, so thanks to all the folks at the Roberson Project for putting this together. Thanks to my colleagues for also speaking. And I mean, for my part, I know I was an undergraduate in college myself, University of Washington up in Seattle. When I first realized that you can't know everything about anything until you know something about everything. You know, by which I mean that, you know, you look at something, a disciplinary group like this, you know, we've had Professor Hopwood kind of talking us through some of the philosophical arguments about this, and it's mentioned quite rightly that, you know, one of the problems is trying to trace some of those harms, which of course is something that historians try to do. And then of course we can't do that without the insights that come from economics. So got to know something about everything to know anything, to know everything about anything. That's it. I was also an undergraduate in college when I first had the opportunity. Well, at any rate, when I first did study African American history in a really systematic sort of way, had the opportunity to study with Stephanie Camp, a tremendous scholar of enslaved families, of enslaved women in particular. Died way too soon. I did get the opportunity to take a class with her, and if you do take a class with my colleague Dr. Anthony Donaldson on African American history, I know that he has Professor Camp's book on his syllabus. So though you don't get to know her personally, she's been taken from us, you can know her through her work. Now, it was from her that I first heard of a guy called Jordan Anderson. And I wonder if anyone in here might have actually heard this letter already, or read this letter that he wrote from Dayton, Ohio in August of 1865. So just a little bit after the end of the Civil War. So he writes to his former enslaver down in Tennessee, Big Spring, Tennessee, a guy called Colonel Anderson, so same surname. And Colonel Anderson had apparently written him a letter asking him to come back and work for him. And so Jordan Anderson begins his reply by saying, well, I got your letter and was glad to find that you had not forgotten Jordan and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anybody else can. He points out, though, that in Tennessee, there was never any payday for the Negroes, any more than for the horses and cows. And then reminds him, based on the words of the Bible, surely there will be a day of reckoning for those who defraud the laborer of his hire. But he does allow, at least in theory, the possibility that he might be persuaded to come back, and says that he and his wife have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. This will make us forget and forgive old scores and rely on your justice and friendship in the future. I served you faithfully for 32 years, and Mandy, his wife, 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits to me and pull in a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Gives him some instructions on where he can send the $11,680 plus interest, and then says, if you fail to pay us for faithful labors in the past, we can have little faith in your promises in the future. Jordan Anderson, it seems to me, I bet it seems to a lot of you all as well, was thinking in terms of reparations. And something that I think he understood, and something for us to understand even all these years later, is that the issue is really centuries of the denial of the most basic economic, social, and political liberties to Black Americans simply because they were Black. And we can get into some of the history of how the concept of race, the way we tend to think of it nowadays, really kind of is a product of the experience of slavery in the Atlantic world and so on. You know, the ideology comes up that there's this biological difference between people with white skin, people with black skin. People with black skin are made for the sort of manual labor to which they were put. That's the kind of the ideology that that justifies this for people at that time. And based on that, again, the denial of these most basic economic, social, and political liberties. And it doesn't end with slavery. Of course, people know of the history after that of, well, Reconstruction and it being thwarted, the attempt to reconstruct Southern society and American society on more just lines. And then, of course, that followed up with Jim Crow, Jane Crow, and all the decades of that. And of course, even with that over, or to a great extent over, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Civil Rights Act of 1964, still even after that, to speak to the inheritance argument, the harms associated with that continue on through the generations, you know, and haven't necessarily been remedied. And as well, I'd suggest that a lot of the arguments that are made against trying to come up with some sort of restitution or compensation for this are oftentimes based on historical misperceptions, many of which Darity and Mullen address in their book, which I've got it out of the library right now. I'm going to turn it back in either tonight or tomorrow. So one of you all can be the next to check it out. But one thing, and this is one I feel particularly well qualified to speak on, given that my research has been on the transatlantic trade, not quite as much slavery in this country, but primarily the transatlantic trade. But this argument still ends up speaking to that. You know, the idea that those Black Africans who were sent to America were initially enslaved by other Black Africans. And oftentimes that's advanced as a reason for saying that, well, white people from Europe, white people from America, they're nothing to do with it. All they've done is purchased people that have already been enslaved. So the only thing that matters is when and where the initial enslavement was carried out and who did that. And I think one thing that helps here is to think of enslavement not as a one-time event, but as an ongoing process. Person's not just enslaved one time and that's the end of it. The way we've kind of started to change the language around how we describe people who are caught up in this system, we're less likely to say nowadays slave owners, slave holders. You know, it almost assumes when you use those terms that it was just that they did that. Of course, it wasn't. Certainly masters. And instead saying enslavers, and that speaks to that idea of this being a process. Enslavers were enslaving people day after day after day. And then enslaved persons, people who it's not essential to their nature that they were slaves, kind of, you know, to say that kind of assumes that thing of that racial hierarchy, that racial inferiority. Instead saying these were persons, these were human beings who at some point were enslaved and are continuing to be enslaved. And then mark this, the fact that, well, the enslaved persons, they receive little or none of the product of what they labor for. You know, almost all of that is going to their enslavers. So every day that the enslavers are enslaving people, they're deriving economic benefit for themselves from that and for their society at large. But that benefit's not going to the people that are doing the work. And this is, when I say society at large, you know, one thing I'm trying to get at here is that it's not just a Southern thing. You know, of course, that's where the enslavement is largely happening. And yet, You've got merchant houses in New York City, and they're benefiting, they're deriving profit from the fact they're moving cotton up to the cotton mills, the textile mills of Massachusetts. You've got insurers in Connecticut writing policies on the lives of enslaved persons. You got mortgages being taken out upon them as if they were lands or houses. You've got university endowments throughout the country, not just in southern states, but throughout the country that are benefiting from the work of enslaved persons, and the benefit of that not going to those doing that work, but their enslavers and people around the enslavers as well. I believe I'm running short on time. I'll have to pick and choose what else I say just now. Maybe some other things will come up in the questions, but another thing to point out, and of course we think of the Civil War as being that moment when enslavement ends in this country, and it's worth saying, I think, that the Civil War was largely fought over the issue of slavery. That's surprisingly controversial, but I think it's worth saying that that was the main issue at stake here. Now, the argument then becomes that, well, reparations, that was done when white Americans enlisted in the Union Army, the Northern Army, the Bluecoats. They signed up for the Army, they fought, they risked their lives, in many cases died, for the freedom of Black Americans. But keep it in mind that Black Americans did too. I think that's something that we often forget, the fact that 180,000 Black Americans enlisted in the United States colored troops during the war. 180,000. Certainly a proportion of the Black population of the country comparable to the portion of the white population that was fighting in this army. 94,000 of the 180,000 came from southern states. And of course, that was largely the point of the Emancipation Proclamation. When Abraham Lincoln issues it, changes the moral tone of this war. It's not just only a war to preserve the Union, it's now a war to do away with slavery. And of course, the inducement here is for enslaved persons to rise up, to take up arms for their own freedom. And so 180,000 answer that call. The historian Stephen Hahn has referred to the United States Civil War as the greatest slave rebellion in modern history, which I think is a way we're not necessarily accustomed to thinking of it. But he suggests that, yes, this is a way to think of it. They took up arms against their enslavers. We could also argue, given that Abraham Lincoln does this as a war measure, brings Black Americans into the struggle under arms to do away with slavery, that in a very real sense, he could then argue that Black Americans saved the United States by enlisting in the Union Army and fighting for the defeat of the Confederacy. Let's see. Got a whole other side here that I'm not going to be able to get to just now. But so many harms, that we talked about slavery just now. Certainly Jim Crow, there's a huge economic aspect to that. Lots of times we're accustomed to think of public transportation, Rosa Parks at the back of the bus, water fountains, schools, things like that. Consider also that throughout most of this period, late 19th century, early to mid 20th century, big aspects of this is that Black Americans, to a great extent, not able to choose their employers. And if they can't choose their employers, how can they negotiate for better terms, better wages, better treatment, and so on? This is actually prophesied by an Alabamian planter in 1865, right after the defeat of the Confederacy. And I'll read what he had to say on this. Things will work back again into their old grooves. The Negro, he used a different word, of course, is going to be made a serf, sure as you live. It won't need any law for that. Planters will have an understanding among themselves. You won't hire my Negroes and I won't hire yours. Then what's left for them? They're attached to the soil and were as much their masters as ever. And the South, for a long time, resisted any attempts by Black persons themselves or by other levels of government, federal government, Social Security when that comes in, GI Bill when that comes in, any sort of interference in that relationship, very cozy relationship from their point of view that doesn't give African Americans much of a chance to come up with a different means for their own economic advancement. Okay, I want to go ahead, finish off here. Quick statistic, Dr. Hopwood alluded to the racial wealth gap. And the Brookings Institution just last year found that in 2016, quoting here, at $171,000, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a black family. So nearly 10 times. And that disparity, of course, comes from largely from housing discrimination, difficulties for African Americans through the years in acquiring real estate. And of course, real estate ends up being the biggest investment most people have. So forestalling that was a big means of creating that racial wealth gap. And then I just want to mention also HR 40, bill in the US Congress, been introduced Congress after Congress by the late John Conyers of Michigan. It's now been taken up by Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas. And it aims to establish a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, to identify the role of federal and state governments in supporting the institution of slavery, forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants, and lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans and society. And in this current Congress, that bill has gotten farther in the legislative process than it ever has. It's gotten a committee markup, so it's never had that before. And I think if Jordan Anderson nowadays could know that, I think he'd be pleased to hear it. Over to you, Professor Thaison.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? All right, I want to start also by thanking the Roberson Project and everybody who's worked with it for the events they're putting on and for bringing Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullen to campus. I'm very excited about this conversation that we're having. From 2009 to 2014, John Christopher Smith, an intellectually disabled man, was enslaved by the owner of the J&J cafeteria in Conway, South Carolina. He was forced to work more than 100 hours a week, physically abused and threatened by the owner for 5 years before someone notified the police and he was freed. In 2019, the owner of the cafeteria was sentenced to 10 years in prison based on 1 count of forced labor. In addition, he was ordered to pay the man he had enslaved $273,000 in unpaid wages and overtime compensation. In May of this year, the appellate court ruled that the original court had erred in its calculation of the monies owed to Smith. Based on federal labor law, it said, Smith was owed $546,000, double the initial award, because of the delay in paying Smith what he was owed, which caused him losses, which the court described as when an employer fails to pay those amounts, and by that they mean pay that is owed to workers, the employee suffers losses, which includes the loss of use of that money during the period of delay. US labor law in this way recognizes an economic principle known as the time value of money, that money received today is worth more than money received at some point in the future. From an economic standpoint, the issue of reparation for the crime of slavery isn't all that different from the judgment of the court in this recent case. Were people harmed by the institution of slavery and the legal constructs we created to maintain that institution? Clearly. Is the effect of these harms ongoing? Absolutely. These harms created a racial-based caste system in the US that continued past the institution of slavery to things like Jim Crow, school segregation, redlining, discrimination in acquisition of housing and mortgages, unequal access to federal benefits. The USDA recently paid $2.4 billion to African-American farmers who had been denied loans that they provided to white farmers for the maintenance of their farms. The GI Bill was structured in such a way that African Americans were denied access to the benefits that accrued to white soldiers who had returned from war. All this pairs with the fact that in the US and the world, the vast majority of wealth is inherited, such that disparities of the past do not disappear, but continue on into the future. Within economics, much of the debate around reparations involves questions of how much is owed, how such an amount would be paid, and in what form. These are really difficult questions for economists to answer, as more than 400 years has passed since the first enslaved African was brought to these shores, and nearly 160 years have passed since the Emancipation Proclamation supposedly ended the institution of slavery in this country. This long length of time means even small differences in evaluating concepts like the time value of money can result in very different estimates of the amount of reparations owed. The monetary estimates for reparations vary widely. Some only in the hundreds of billions of dollars, all the way up to a high estimate that I have seen of $42.2 trillion. These differences come about from small differences in how we calculate what people were owed at the time of enslavement. What things have happened since then are attributable to enslavement and the racially based caste system we have in this country, and what the time value of money is. How much should that money appreciate because of the time that has been withheld from the rightful recipients? These are not easy questions to parse out, but in my field, the issue of reparations doesn't revolve around the idea that money is owed, but more about how much. How do we figure out the right amount? I will say that people opposed to reparations in the field of economics often use these questions as a way to say we can't possibly figure this out. There's no way to do it, when in fact, it's quite clear there are ways to figure things out and come to an agreement. Now, without going into sort of the issue of how much exactly is the appropriate amount, questions then arise over what are the consequences sort of economically of paying such a vast amount to a group of people within the country. Many people discuss the idea of inflation and that this could be substantially inflationary, right? You guys think back to economic stimulus, right? During the financial crisis or during COVID, right? Where the government gives money to citizens in order to keep the economy from sliding too far, right? From going down too far. In the same way, reparations for slavery would be stimulative to the economy and we would see economic growth. But economic growth that tends to be too rapid can also cause inflation, and people worry about that. Okay, and so that's one issue. And so how could we go about this? Well, we as a country have the physical ability to go about this. I just want to assert that strongly. It's not about not being able to do it. It's about our priorities and what we decide we want to do. The Federal Reserve Bank of the United States is the central bank for the country. They manage huge sums of money. During the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the Federal Reserve Bank undertook programs where they bought $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities a month to maintain the financial markets. At the same time, they were buying $45 billion a month in long-term treasury securities. During the financial crisis itself, they created $3 trillion in additional monetary base money for the economy. During COVID, they turned back to the same sort of tools. They spent $2.7 trillion buying securities to shore up the marketplace. These things can be done. Congress can do these things as well. We look to some of the things that we have chosen to do as a country. COVID in particular is quite recent in our minds. And in March of 2020, we spent $2.2 trillion on a COVID relief package, and then turned around just over a year later and spent another $1.9 trillion on a COVID relief package. Doing this cost us money. We upped the US's borrowing substantially. We went from borrowing about $1 billion the year prior to COVID to, in 2020, borrowing $2.2 trillion. I think I just said billion. Or almost $1 trillion the year prior to COVID, 2.2 during the COVID year. We can borrow huge sums of money as a country if we need to finance our spending. Why? Economic theory suggests that these kinds of actions should have consequences in the world marketplace. That when we borrow huge amounts of money, when we stimulate the economy, there should be large consequences. Stimulating the economy should result in inflation. Borrowing money in large sums should result in our currency losing some of its value, in interest rates rising. But fundamentally, when we look at these actions by the US government, we do not see these kinds of consequences. There are many reasons why we don't see these kinds of consequences, but an important one is that the US holds a position that the economist Barry Eichengreen calls exorbitant privilege. And the exorbitant privilege that the US holds is that we have a currency that is what we call a vehicle currency. It is the currency that is used in the vast majority of the world for international transactions. 85% roughly of all foreign exchange transactions in the world involve the US dollar. There are 200 currencies in the world. 85% of transactions, currency transactions involve the US dollar. Why? Because we're a vehicle currency. International trade that takes place in the world between countries that are not the US often denominates itself in dollars, and goods are bought and paid for using dollars. And what that means is that people outside of the borders of this country want our currency for use in transactions. And because of that, they buffer us in ways that other countries do not get buffering from some of the financial ramifications of our spending, which we can see in a variety of arenas, from the government budget deficits to the trade deficits that we run year after year. So, having said this, what I'm going to say is this is still a very complicated question. But there's strong evidence that this is a doable thing, that we can figure out how to make this work. Now, the last question that economists would ask is, well, okay, if we can figure out that we can afford this, and we can figure out that we can print money through the Federal Reserve, and we can borrow money through the US government to finance reparations, then how do we deliver those reparations to the people who are owed? And that is perhaps the most complicated question from an economic standpoint. And I should say, as an economist, I was actually looking at something today on Twitter where someone had said they loved economics because there's always an answer if you're willing to like look and figure it out. And I really wanted to reply to them and go, well, not really, not always. Like, there's not always an answer, like a right answer. There's nuance, right? There's trade-offs. Some things are good, some things are bad. People who are concerned about inflation, when we talk about reparations, may say, well, what we should really do is not give people cash, but give them investments, bonds, for example, right? We give them bonds that they can have to hold and sort of spend more slowly. This will keep the inflationary spike down, right? And then as an economist, I go, okay, but like, why should we force people to not be able to spend their money like over a shorter period of time if that's what's best for them, right? And so there's trade-offs here and things that have to be thought about. And I guess I should say, like, the answer is not clear, right? Because it's all a matter of weighing costs and benefits of various systems. There's been lots of things that have been suggested, things like baby bonds, right? Giving bonds to children when they're born. that they will be able to use to build wealth later in their lives, giving direct cash payments to people right now, helping people invest in real estate, right? Which, as we've said, is sort of the vehicle for wealth growth for most American families, right? All of these things have pros, but also cons. And so it's a matter of figuring it out. Having said that, my assertion as an economist is, I think, something that my colleagues would agree with, which is you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or in this case, the right. And so we have to do what's right without necessarily taking forever to figure out the perfect way to do it. Okay. And I guess I'll end there.
Okay, thank you all thank you very much for those contributions and getting us thinking in your different ways here. We're going to open the floor up for questions in just a moment, but I was wondering if you could each reflect a bit in light of what you've said here, looking at the big picture, from philosophy, from economics, from history, and thinking in particular about the local scene. I mean, here we are in Convocation Hall. We're surrounded by, I think I counted 15 portraits. They've changed the numbers since I last counted. There used to be 16. But I think that 13 of these portraits, all of these are figures who were important in the founding, the early generations of the university. I think that 12 or 13 of these men here on the walls all have some deep connection with the enslavement of people in the era before of the 1850s. Either they were enslavers themselves, or they were the sons of enslavers. Now, this is not the message that you get when you look at this room. I'm not sure I'd be interested to know what message y'all think these portraits tell you. But this is a kind of hall. It's not just the hall of founders, of religious leaders in the founding of the church. It's also a hall of enslavers. So thinking about that and the way in which we construct a room like this to remind us of where we came from, of those whose efforts, whose shoulders we stand on. What role, or how should this university in particular think about its need to address the question of reparations, need to address its own thought of what, if repair is in order, and how we might go about it. So I wonder if y'all might reflect on this a little bit from your own perspectives. We'll start down at the end with you, Professor Hopwood.
Sure, thank you. This on? Okay, good. So I'll be very brief because I want to hear the questions that people have. But I would say, applying some of what I said earlier to the case of Swanee, I think we could ask ourselves two questions, right? So one, we would think about the spiritual renewal argument that I discussed, and we could ask, does Swanee need a spiritual renewal when it comes to the legacies of the Confederacy, of slavery and racism? I want to say the answer is clearly yes. I would be happy to have a conversation about that, but I think we do. And then if we think that we need a process of spiritual renewal here at Swanee, a second question is that process going to look serious if at some point it does not cost us something that we would not otherwise have spent? And I suspect the answer to that question is no. So those are the two questions that I would use to frame our thinking about Swanee. And I'll leave it there and be very brief.
Mm-hmm. Professor Thaison.
So without particular facts at my disposal, right? It's very difficult to ascertain things that economists might wish to know. Like, I would agree with Professor Hopwood that having a cost associated with reparations would be important. And as an economist, I would say, well, how much is that cost, right? What is the amount that we owe? But without specific facts at my disposal, it would be very, very difficult for me to ascertain the amount we owe. To the extent that the institution was founded with money that was profit that was gained through the institution of slavery, one might suggest that we owe a great deal. That the institution itself at its foundation, at its founding, was an institution designed to profit, I think, as the founders would have said, the white race, at the expense of people who were enslaved, and then, of course, after the Civil War, at the expense of people who were tied to the land in the way that Professor Mitchell suggested, sharecroppers who earned very little money for their labor because the landowner retained the vast majority, and then the landowner either paid tuition to send their child to Swanee or endowed things at this institution. And so figuring out amounts would be very difficult, but I think it's an important process to think through.
Right, so I think that idea of spiritual renewal is something that I want to run with here, and and the role that history plays in that. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Professor Hopwood, one word that didn't come up there was reconciliation, which sounds like a church kind of word, and it is. But really, before it's that, it's a financial kind of word, right? You know, it comes from double entry accounting. So you got the one side of the ledger, the other side of the ledger doesn't match up. You know, if you go and reconcile your checkbook, it's like, okay, I got my record of what I spent. We've got the bank's record of what they say I've spent. Do these two things match up? So it's come into this reckoning of what happened. And of course, that reckoning has not been, when it comes to the legacy of slavery, when it comes to the legacy of racial hierarchy in this country, that legacy, and ascertaining that legacy, reckoning with that legacy, figuring out what that legacy even is, has not been straightforward. Darity and Mullen, they talk of this process of dismemory that has occurred. You know, not memory, but dismemory, remembering things in a way that didn't actually happen. I guess another way you could think of it is almost like slavery denial, or denial of the worst effects of slavery, denial of the actual effects of slavery, trying to minimize what it was, trying to minimize what was taken from those that were enslaved, both in terms of the labor and in terms of non-monetary types of things as well. What it was to have lost their freedom, what it was to constantly having to fight to assert their humanity, and so on. And so, you know, the part of the question then becomes, how do we go about doing that research? What remains to research? What do we still not know about what it is that actually happened? And what are ways that in the past, people have actively tried to look away from what it was that happened? How are we still looking away from what it was that happened? And I think as well, it can't be something that's just confined to this campus in particular, or to college campuses in general. You know, I think it's very important to address that gap between what folks know about it in academia and what folks know about it in the general public. And of course, just how this stuff is to be taught in schools between the kindergarten year and the 12th grade year. If folks are keeping up with the news, that's become a bit of a hot topic in recent weeks and months. And I think it's really important to contend for really trying to get at the truth and leave behind those ways of looking away from what happened that we've had in the past, and really try to make that reckoning that can bring us to even the possibility of a real reconciliation.
Thank you. Questions in the audience?
This is for Professor Hopwood. Is that how to pronounce your name correctly? Cool. So a spiritual reckoning, in my mind, means that there are specific parameters in which a holistic American identity can be formed. By holistic American, I mean one where people have pride in being an American, or pride in being an American is contingent on both an awareness and analytical grappling of a country that has in ideal been the beacon of liberty, but historically and in practice been a system that privatizes people. In other words, white Americans will become painfully aware of the malpractice of American institutions and social norms. It is from this juncture that I ask you, what does this fundamentally do to change Black lives in America, rather than simply symbolically? What sort of expectations are there for change of behavior as a response to change in consciousness?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's a great question. And I mean, the concept of pride is a useful one to have here. I recently became American. I got my American citizenship fairly recently, and there's like a little part of me that was proud about it, or felt like I can now be proud of certain things I associate with America. And there's also a part of me that recognizes, well, there's a lot that I have to be ashamed of as well. And so I think those two things need to go together. We can't have pride without having the appropriate degree of shame. But I think the point that you raised is a really important one. If we want to talk in terms of spiritual renewal, and I do think it's a useful concept, that cannot be like therapy for white people that doesn't do anything for the lives of Black people, right? And that's the risk that we run. And I think that's the risk that that Darity and Mullen are really concerned about when they want to focus on restitution and not atonement. Like, this is their worry. And I think it's a really important worry. I don't think it means that we shouldn't think about spiritual renewal at all. But I think that we should have this caution about the possibility of engaging in thoughts and words without actions. And we need to have this principle really uppermost in our minds that in many cases, reparation is not the same as restitution, but in many cases it can't happen without restitution. And so I think that just needs to be a part of the conversation from the beginning. But I think you just raised an excellent point.
First of all, I just want to thank you all for talking about this. It's really interesting. So this question kind of follows from that one where you were both discussing this idea of sort of emotional discussion without like financial or like sort of this more tangible action. And throughout the panel, I've been curious about how you see these two sort of necessary sides to reparations, this like more tangible like monetary side and the less tangible emotional and spiritual side being integrated, because they're both necessary, but they behave very differently in this kind of like formal action, in this formal process. And so like, how do you see those being treated in a way so that they can move side by side and neither one of them is abandoned or, I guess, like counted for less throughout this like continuous experience?
I'd be happy to speak to that.
I mean, I think it's absolutely necessary that they do move together, because on the one hand, you can kind of picture, okay, you got the spiritual renewal, but no monetary aspect to that, no restitution, no reparations being made. You could picture that looking to many people like it's rather empty. And then on the other hand, if you have the money changing hands without the spiritual renewal, without that side of things, you could picture people really resenting the hell out of it. So yeah, they've absolutely got to move together. There's no doubt of that.
I think, I mean, one example that I give, this is going to be an example to illustrate the problem you're raising rather than really solve it. But when the last panel we had, our panelist from VTS, Ebony, what's the second name?
Davis.
Ebony Davis, yeah. So Ebony Davis, who's at Virginia Theological Seminary, when she was asked, so VTS is like right now making payments to people. They are doing it. And when she was asked, how do you think other institutions should think about making restitution payments? She said, just jump right in, do it. We're building the plane while we're flying it, but just go ahead and do it. And so I think it's interesting to see the kind of urgency that she attributes to that. On the other hand, someone asked a really good question of her, of like, what is it like when you call people and tell them they've been traced as, VTS call them shareholders. So you've been traced as a shareholder. How do people react? And she said, well, there's a range, but some people will tell her, look, I don't want that money. That's blood money. And so that speaks to, I think, the difficulty, on the one hand, I think there is something important in what she was saying about jumping in at a certain point. You have to do things without quite fully knowing what you're doing. On the other hand, if you're doing things without quite fully knowing what you're doing, you're interfering in people's lives in a way that I think can feel very invasive to them. And so that's like if we're thinking about this as an institution, if we're thinking about this as a country, like thinking about people who are on the recipient end of the transaction, how they receive it and how they're prepared to receive it. So yeah, it's hard, but that's an example of the problem you're raising.
But I guess just to elaborate a little bit on the Virginia Theological Seminary example, they really had joined relationship building with their shareholders, with the payment of the money reparations to them. And certainly there were some people who felt like it wasn't enough. But I think that for me, the integration of these two sides of the coin that I would say is reparations was really important, that they didn't just say, oh, we've paid money and now we're free of whatever wrongs we did in the past. But instead, our job is to create positive relationships with this community that we had exploited in the past, and hopefully over time create benefits for the wider community in a sort of understanding of what was done, and that we not only owe these monetary reparations, but we need to come to an understanding of responsibility as well. And I think that's part of the issue in this country, is we have difficulty taking responsibility for things that happened in the past. And I know it can be difficult because people feel like, well, I didn't do that. It wasn't me. But the system was a legal system that we generated in a really formal structure that didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. I was reading something recently about a book that summarizes laws on race in this country. It's 700 pages long. It's a summary. We've done this over and over and over again, and we have to be able to acknowledge that before we can go forward building positive relationships.
Hi. So this has something to do with your last comment. So the United States have historically wronged a lot of different groups of people, like indigenous people or Asian Americans. And talking about reparations with other people, like my family, an argument that came up was that it might be unethical to only give one group of people certain reparations while other people are not granted reparations. So how would reparations look like? Would it be more unethical to only acknowledge certain groups of people? And is there a way for reparations to be given to all these different groups of people that the United States have harmed historically together? Thank you.
Yeah, I actually say something to that, because there's a moral question there, whether it's, is it worse to do it just for one group and while you're not doing it for others? And I think you raise a really important point. I'm glad you raised the point that this is reparations for slavery are not the only form of reparations. In some ways, they're not even the most obvious. the initial kind of there's the wrong going all the way back to the appropriation of land, right? So it's right to consider those other cases. I think I would want to say, from a moral perspective, you might say it would be bad to start thinking about reparations for one group and not think about reparations for other groups. I think it might be even worse not to do reparations for any group at all. And so we're making at least some progress thinking about one case. But yeah, if we're talking about a process of spiritual renewal, we need that more broadly. I mean, my general answer would be kind of yes, and we need to consider those cases as well.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that the U.S. has paid reparations to some groups for wrongs that were done to them. I think we can look back in history and perhaps I don't know if Professor Mitchell can say more about this than I can, but I know, for example, grievous wrongs were committed against Japanese Americans during World War II when they were put into concentration camps throughout this country, and at the conclusion of the war, they were paid reparations, perhaps inadequate ones, but reparations were still paid. And there have been other sort of situations like that where the US government has agreed to make repair, typically for smaller kinds of situations, incidents of discrimination or land appropriation. And so we already do pay reparations some. I guess we're actually already past the point where no one gets reparations. The question of whether or not we can pay reparations to everybody who has been wronged, I think, is a situation of the perfect being the enemy of the good, in my perspective. And also, it feels like a hurdle that's impossible to overcome until I can identify every group of people that the US has wronged, and trust me, it's a lot. Can I do anything for anybody? And I would argue that that's not the way forward in a spirit of reconciliation and creating a country of sort of unified understanding of who we are and where we are going. So that's my.
And certainly I think that there's kind of that matter of history and bringing forward the facts and the peculiarities of each case. You know, and that's a matter of historical research and also a matter of historical education. You know, we can talk about also the ways in which these things are left out of the official story, the story that most people carry around in their heads of what's happened in this country. You know, where these acts of discrimination that have occurred, these acts of discrimination that have been done by some people to other people in this country, by this country to particular people, just don't really come up in the way that people are thinking about these things. And of course, here we're talking largely in terms of reparations for slavery, reparations for Jim Crow, reparations to African Americans. But those conversations need to happen as well. You know, absolutely, conversations about other forms of discrimination that have happened. And I think that's, I thank you for bringing that up.
I was going to encourage you to come here, Professor Darity and Ms. Mullen speak this coming week, because they address this issue or this question in particular. So I hope you'll be back.
I mean, it's kind of the case. They're really going to talk about how undergraduate students in particular can get involved in these efforts.
Well, that's part of the plan, yes. There's another question over here. Yeah.
Well, this could be directed at really any of you, but each of you touched on this lightly, I think. But what would you say would be the best way to discern who would receive reparations? Not necessarily speaking in like the heritage form that, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
That's right, Hopwood.
Hopwood, thank you. But what do you think would be the best way to really figure out who receives what in terms of reparations?
So it's a really good question because it's complicated, right? In some sense, some people argue that if the reparations are explicitly for slavery, right, that in fact descendants of Africans who were enslaved in this country are the rightful recipients. But I sort of alluded to the idea that slavery in the US set up a racially based caste system, and that system has, of course, lived on past the institution of slavery. And so African Americans who have lived in this country past the institution of slavery were also disadvantaged in many ways in their lives. And so is reparation owed for that? It's a very complicated question. Are we talking only about slavery? Or are we talking about slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and all these other discriminatory practices that went on. I think the answer is different depending on which one of these things we're talking about. I know Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullins suggest that the issue is that that Black Americans have been disadvantaged through systems and that they should receive reparations, and that essentially all you have to show is that you have identified as Black at some point for a period of time prior to the institution of reparations. And I believe their suggestion was 12 years, that if starting 12 years before the institution of reparations, you can show that you identified as Black, right? How you answered your census paperwork, right? When you filled out the question on race and ethnicity, that would be sufficient to determine that you would be a recipient of reparations. That's a simple way to think about it. I think it's a simple answer. It's not a perfect answer.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and it's a good question. And I mean, the one thing I would add is I think, so I've talked about, we've talked about a couple of ways of doing it. You can think about it in terms of inheritance. You can think about it in terms of harms. I think one thing that's really important, particularly, let's say we're thinking about the Swanee context, and Swanee is trying to decide, well, we want to make some payments, but who to? It strikes me as crucial, as I said, who is in the room to make that decision? Because I think, if we imagine a certain group of people making that decision, say we have a small group of white men making that decision, what I want to say is there's basically whatever answer they come up with is not going to be right. If that's the not because they're not smart enough, right, but because that's not the right process. And so it strikes me as being just as important is what kind of process do you have in place and who is involved in that. And I think it's one of the reasons why some of the work that the Roberson Project's been doing kind of with the Swanee Black community and Swanee Black history is so important, like to be including a wider group of people in these conversations.
So I'm interested to know if there are any approaches from your three disciplines that are not just sort of at the national or the institutional level, but at the more personal level of like white America's responsibility. I know in my family, we enslaved people. My ancestors did. My family also benefited from white supremacist institutions, including my dad's education at this school in the 1970s. Why am I not paying anything?
Well, I'm going to appeal to Darity and Mullen here, and I just finished reading their book that we've been referring to so many times just today. And one thing that they suggest is that quite possibly the most far-reaching thing you can do is to get on board with the efforts, the more collective efforts, the wider efforts towards reconciliation and towards reparations. That might end up doing more than what you could possibly do on kind of that more individual level. And then aside from that, I'd also kind of add, well, just continuing to study and know the history. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So there's another philosopher who I like, who I haven't mentioned, Iris Marion Young. She's a philosopher and political theorist, and she's interested in questions about structural injustice. And I think when we talk about the institution of slavery and Jim Crow, we're talking about structural injustices, and that there were individual injustices were perpetrated. Of course, individuals did things that we would regard as profoundly wrong, but they did them within structures that facilitated that. And I think one of the big insights that Young has is that structural injustices demand structural responses. And so I think if we're thinking about a structural injustice, we have to think about, sure, like individual responsibility, but individual responsibility as members of a broader structure. So the question has to be, what can I, as a member of this broader structure, do? And so that might involve things like lobbying. It might involve all kinds of things. But I think we have to be thinking in terms of our role within a structure.
Well, yeah, I think that's very much an individual thing to do as well. There's always that question of structure versus agency. To what extent does any particular individual, to what extent can they impact structures? And certainly, when lots of people get together and decide, hey, we want to move to try and change this structure, that's when structures can change.
I'm wondering about each of your perspectives on the scope of reparation. Should they be given at a federal level, or we've kind of been discussing, should they be given at the local level, like discussing Sewanee's specific relationship with slavery? Or Professor Mitchell, I know you talked about the transatlantic trade. Is this something we could do at the global level? Is that feasible, discussing between countries, everybody's relationship with slavery?
Why are you guys looking at me?
Well, she said your name.
She said, yeah.
Because that's a really hard one. I mean,
I was going to say reparations have been done at an international level. Like, it's happened in the past. Sadly, not in the way you might wish, at least the incidences that I'm thinking of. I mean, Haiti was the first Black democracy in this country when they threw off French enslavement, and Haiti was made to pay reparations to France that continued until the 70s. I mean, hundreds of years they paid reparations to France. International reparations have absolutely happened, but they paid reparations because they stole the property of French enslavers. So it has happened. It is possible, but France forgave the tail end of the reparations that Haiti owed them. But there's been a movement to try to convince France that they should give this back to Haiti, and France is not budging on that. So while it has happened, I think it would be extremely difficult to convince countries to transfer funds in that way.
and one thing I want to point out, maybe even widen the scope even further, if that's not way too daunting already. I'm thinking in terms of the environment, in terms of climate change and climate justice. Of course, so many of the carbon emissions that have occurred have been in many of the same countries that grew rich through slavery at an earlier point in time. And of course, so many of the harms that are being done are to countries where slaves were brought at an earlier date, countries that were parts of European empires later on, countries that are in tropical regions nowadays that are in greatest danger from climate change. And I mean, I see a really scary, but I think really profound way in which this does connect. I mean, one of my great nightmares for the future is in terms of the possibility of large-scale climate refugees and large-scale movements of population. And I wonder, if indeed those do wind up happening, on what terms are they going to happen? And most scary of all, will they end up happening on terms that in any sort of way resemble those of previous trades in enslaved persons? Is that our future? I devoutly hope it isn't. But I think that's something to be concerned about, something to act against. I think in the present, even as we're also thinking about past harms from slavery, and I think they do profoundly connect with each other.
Maybe one more question. Over here.
So you guys, I think all have touched on the racial caste system that kind of grew out of slavery. As far as like payments go, I feel like money can only go so far and do so much. And I think the caste system kind of remains after these reparations, or absolutely remains after these reparations would be paid. So could reparations take the form of kind of educational grants and money towards education as opposed to those direct payments?
I think that's especially appropriate in the case of educational institutions where, that's what they do, is provide educational services. So providing those for free, encouraging those who were denied opportunities to develop human capital because of slavery, because of Jim Crow. I think that's definitely a way to proceed. Now, that said, I mean, what can money do? What can you do with money? It's not just a thing of, buying ephemeral consumer goods and services and things like that. A lot of times it's, buying real estate, buying property, buying stocks, and building a business of one's own in ways that have historically been difficult. The financial system in so many ways has been biased, in many ways continues to be biased. But money that circumvents that and is just given to people who've suffered from those biases and from harms originating from further back, I think that can certainly, I think Professor Thaison alluded to this earlier as well, that can kickstart some sorts of economic growth, some sorts of development of businesses, investments in real estate in ways that perhaps hasn't been done previously. Of course, there could have been once upon a time an opportunity to do this, something I did have to leave out in my earlier comments. The whole idea, and probably a lot of you have heard the phrase, 40 acres and a mule, right? The idea that that freed people had so recently been enslaved on these lands by people who'd gone into rebellion against the United States government. Could that land be confiscated from the rebels, given to those who'd worked that land basically for no benefit to themselves all those years? That would have made a huge difference, because with that land, certainly in that economic context, that means not just land and not just money, but economic independence, not having to go back to work as a sharecropper for the guy that once enslaved a person, being able to produce a product of one's own. Economic independence, social independence, political independence could have come from that, but didn't. And in our modern age, not so many of us anymore make money directly from farm and land, but money that can go into those investments, it can play that same sort of role today, I think.
Just to add one sentence to that. I think it's a good question, but when we're thinking about a racial caste system and money, I think it's important to say it's always been about the money. the racial caste system that we have.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think this is one reason why money has to be a part of the answer and a part of the conversation. There's never been such a thing as the racial caste system without the economics and the money that were behind it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Professor Mitchell, Professor Thaison, Professor Hopwood, for your contributions this evening.
And thanks to the audience.
And well, I did, yes. And thank you, audience. And I remind you that the events next week with Professor Darity and Ms. Mullen are, there's a public presentation in Gary Auditorium right over here on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. And then there will be a open forum, town hall kind of meeting with our guests on Friday at 2 o'clock here in this room, Convocation Hall. And that will be a more freewheeling kind of discussion and chance to exchange ideas and opinions with our guests. So I hope you can make both of those events next week. Thursday at 7 p.m., Friday at 2 p.m. here. Thank you all.